but I didn't come from a culture that looked well upon mental health challenges and was still a little bit suspicious of the medical industry in general because
Yeah.
of the complex relationship that African Americans have had with, Western health professionals. So
Yeah.
yeah, I went to doctors and stuff, but like, no, we don't tell strangers our problems. That's not something we do, right? You just
Yeah.
handle it. So it really wasn't until I went to college and really graduate school that was like, I feel like I really need some help. And I really need to
Right.
talk to somebody about my feelings and my emotions. Somewhere I might live long enough to have some sustained help. And I had been diagnosed with depression, but it always seemed like, well, here's a particular situation that's caused it. It wasn't kind
Hmm.
of put in this context of my family, or no one talked about generational trauma in the 90s, even. I mean, not no one, but people didn't do that on a regular basis, not like
Sure.
we do now. So I didn't have a language really until I was so deeply depressed and suicidal and falling apart on my job in my later 20s that one of my coworkers was like, I think I know someone you should talk to. And that person said, I really don't think I can handle your problem, but I know someone you should talk to.
Hmm.
And I
That's
got
good.
to a really good psychiatrist who was able to really help me lay out these larger patterns and see what I was experiencing also in a larger context. Then I was like, wow. But when I talked to my family about it, no one sounds surprised, right? Nobody's like, no way. People are like, yeah, me too, right? This was
Wow.
just something we didn't talk about.
Yeah. And do you think that was, I mean, you've mentioned a couple of things. You grew up in a Christian home, you're a part of an African American family. Is this a religious thing, a cultural thing? Is this an American thing? What's your perspective on why we very often don't want to talk about these types of issues?
Yes, 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 right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of it is, I'll say, cultural. Communities of color
Yeah.
in the United States. I know, especially African American ones and Latinx communities are don't have the best relationship with the mental health community and are often,
Mm.
in some ways, so guarded because of our experiences of racism that I've taught from a very early age. Don't let them see you sweat, right? You don't want to show
Yeah.
your vulnerabilities to a wider world that may not be welcoming to you, right?
Hmm.
You only want to show your good sides because your weaknesses may be used against you in career or in professions or different things. And
Yeah.
so I think a lot of that is cultural and understandable, right? I
Hmm.
mean, there have been studies even that schizophrenia was overdiagnosed in African Americans and Latinos for years because people would say, I'm talking to my ancestors. And therapists who didn't have any cultural competency would say, oh my gosh, they're delusional. And like, no, that's our faith, right? And so it's kind of a cultural faith expression. So some of it also bleeds into religion, right? And so
Yeah.
there are ways in which people might express their faith would then be misdiagnosed as having a kind of, so people are often misdiagnosed, right? And then you have the case where at least in some of the Christianity I was raised in, we have expressions like, oh, you're too blessed to be stressed, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Or that if you were saved, you were happy about that. You're supposed to be always kind of happy and upbeat, and that was a reflection of your faith. Or that if you prayed hard enough, you you wouldn't be sad. Now, no one thought
Yeah.
that about diabetes, right? But
Yeah.
they would say, oh, well, you must not be praying right, or you must, maybe this is punishment for a sin that you've committed. I mean, all these kind of rationales that weren't like, go get you a therapist that might be able to help you. And so I would say, in many ways, it's a combination of that.
Yeah.
Um, I think that American culture is much better about therapists, and a lot of that probably depends on where you are. I lived in
Hmm.
California for a long time, so everyone has a therapist, like everyone has an agent, right? Like it's it's a little bit vogue, right? So I think if you're in like kind of larger urban areas, there's less stigma than there are if you're in smaller towns.
Yeah, true. I'm just thinking of my own, cultural context. And I'm Australian. I live here, but I grew up in Oregon, for my childhood. And so I always thought that only people in big cities or rich people had therapists. So for me, that was a very, elite sort of thing to have a therapist. And, your experience to mine and your cultural context is very different, but I grew up in a Christian home as well. And I think that was a very prevalent, even if it wasn't said, it was a very prevalent sort of understanding that if if you know Jesus, if you love Jesus, you should be fine. So kind of get your act together, you know,
Right.
take
Mhm.
captive your thoughts and change your mind, sort of thing.
Yes,
So
very much so.
yeah. So how do you, I don't know who's listening today and what faith backgrounds they come from or what experience they've had with mental health, but what would you say to someone who maybe comes from that kind of a context that mental health just feels like an issue of thoughts rather than actual, brain chemistry or that type of thing?
Well, I guess I would say two things. First, I would say, if you have, there are very few religions now, not none, but very few, that if you had high blood pressure, wouldn't tell you to go to the doctor. If you had diabetes, wouldn't tell you to go to a doctor. If you had a deep legal issue, wouldn't tell you to go to a lawyer, right? And so
Right.
it's really understanding mental health also as as a medical condition, right?
Mm,
And all medical conditions, all physical conditions have mental and physical components to them. If you're sick long enough, you feel terrible mentally because you're sick, right? Whatever
yeah.
kind of sick you are. And so that's the first thing I would say is like there's no contradiction between your faith and getting help for a medical issue.
Yeah.
And most of us are pretty okay with that when in a certain class of medical issues, right? A certain
Yeah.
kind.
Yeah.
The second thing I would say, particularly for those of us who are deists or believe God or the universe knows us, is that God knows us. And so you don't have to like fake the funk with God, right?
Yeah.
Like God already knows kind of where we are, how we're doing, what's going on with us. And so part of an act of faith is just to keep it real with God. If you're angry, if you're mad, if you're sad, be like, yo, God, what's up? Or you know, to be able to really bring the fullness of who we are before God. We may not always be able to do that before our worship community or our faith community, but when we are kind of alone in our spiritual practice or in our spirituality, we're allowed to be who we really are, however we are.
Hmm. And so how does someone know if they should, you know, if it's not just a circumstantial sadness? How do you said you had a kind coworker that really eyeballed you and said, I have someone that can help. And then that, took you in a series of events to find the person that really could help. What about that person that hasn't had someone eyeball them, but they're kind of wondering, is this normal? I've lost someone. Is this normal sadness? Is there more to it? What would you say from your own experience?
I would say if you're wondering, then yes, right?
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
I feel like we could all use a therapist. Like we get an annual physical to make sure your heart's ticking and your blood work and this and the other. We could all use just let's run by a therapist once a year, see how I'm doing.
Yeah.
It's kind of a normal checkup because life is hard and regular life will just throw things your way that are difficult,
Mm,
right? Like grief is a part of life. We lose things, right? We lose relationships. I know you do work in pregnancy loss. I've lost pregnancies. I've lost people I love who have died. Um, is it normal grief? It might be normal grief, but it's still good to talk to somebody about it,
yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
It could
Yeah.
be a situational depression, but it's your situation and it's real to you, right?
Yeah. For you, do you feel like when you're talking about issues like this, I'd love to hear how does your faith factor? And you talked a bit about, being real with God,
Mhm.
but do you think that God heals? Can you comment on that? How does that work? Because we do pray for healing if someone is diagnosed with cancer or if someone, gets a serious case of strep throat, we pray that they would get healed. And, what do you pray for healing around mental health or how do you do that?
That's a great question. I guess I'll answer that in two parts. In terms of my own faith, intense suffering changes your faith. At least for me, it changed my
Yeah.
faith. And I wasn't ready for that. And I wasn't ready to question things I'd been taught, to find that things that used to work for me spiritually don't work for me anymore.
Yeah.
That was a surprise. I didn't like it. I didn't know what to do with it. I was dumbstruck, and yet I was a religious professional. Right? Like I was a minister and I still had to show up and do ministerial things, and I was very bad at it.
Mhm.
And so part of it was understanding that suffering changes us. And so, of course, it's going to change our faith. And
Yeah.
that's okay. That no one had really told me that part of the spiritual life is losing your faith and finding it again, and losing it and finding it again. And we find it won't be like the one we lost. It'll be okay, but it won't be what we lost. So for me, I'd want everyone to know that because now that I know that, it's not so bad. Like when I feel like I don't have anything to say to you, God, or I'm just not feeling great, or really, right? Why now? Like this is what we had to do, you
Mhm.
know.
Mhm.
I feel okay with that. If I'm frustrated, I feel like it's okay. If I'm suffering, I feel like God is with me, and God is holding me, and God is sad that I'm sad. Right.
Yeah.
So that's really, I feel like, I guess most of my faith goes like God's like a big hug, right? And really holding me through my most difficult times and understanding how I feel, even when no one else does.
Yeah.
But when it comes to healing, I don't think I pray or I find it helpful to pray for healing like a cure, right? Like make sure it has the happy ending I want it to have, because there's so many factors that go into why one person gets strep throat, takes a little penicillin, and they're fine. Someone else goes in the hospital, gets a cut, gets a staph infection, and dies. Like,
Yeah.
it's some of it's just like, whoa, it's random, right? And did God love one person more than the other? Did God heal one person and not heal the other? What I really pray for is for the healing of society, right? That we will have better access to healthcare, that
Mhm.
we will have universal healthcare,
Mhm.
that we would remove stigmas, that we would be supportive of one another, that we would notice each other. And when we ask, how are you? We pause to really hear how someone's doing.
Yeah.
Like, I think those are my prayers, right? Is that we heal as a people, right? As a community, so that we put structures in place that don't say erase the hard parts of life, but help us get through the hard parts of life.
Yeah. Oh, it's so good. That's so good. I've just been reading the Torah the last little while, and it's so painful sometimes to read the Old Testament. It's so hard, but I've just been reminded again how me as an American, Australian, growing up in this century, um, I am just so naturally so individualistic, and yet these people were so concerned with the whole and the community, and God dealt with them as a people, not necessarily as individuals. And not that that discounts the way he relates to us as individuals, but it was just really confronting to me again, all over again, how we really, man, we love to just kind of think about ourselves and not our place in the collective. So I love that you broadened it to that. Thank you. um did you mentioned that you had that you've had many times of sort of losing your faith and finding it again, and that it's evolved through that time. Can you give me an example of perhaps a season like that, what that was like for you?
Yeah, I guess I think the first time I really